Good day, good afternoon, good morning to all our viewers from across the globe where they might be joining us. Today I am seated across one of my very good friends,
Hello.
but also an incredible storyteller, a writer, a thinker, and an award-winning filmmaker.
Hello.
Sihle-Isipho Nontshokweni. And today we're coming to you from the Center for African Studies at Harvard University in Massachusetts. And we're really just kind of thinking about work that we've developed over the past couple of years, thinking about, thinking for Blackness, and in the case of South Africa, Blackness and indigeneity. And I must qualify the concept of indigeneity here, which is to say that I use the two interchangeably because we often forget that Blackness is indigenous to the African continent. There's a certain particular erasure that takes place that facilitates even further erasures. And today we will be talking about the Black Archive with my dear friend. And I wonder, Sihle, if you would just want to kind of welcome us and welcome our viewers
Absolutely.
on to today's episode.
Yeah. Hello to the listeners of the Black Archive. It's such a joy for me to be here today with this incredible thinker. And I was just saying to him now, the fact that we're filming this from Harvard is because of his continued boldness and courage and craziness as well. And it is his work that's really legitimized this moment and allowed for it to happen. And so to start, I just want to say thank you for who you are. But I think I want to give the viewers a little bit of context. When I first met Siseko, the first time he visited me in my office after we'd met at a higher education conference, he comes and he's wearing a ring, right? Oh, he was wearing a ring at the conference. And I say to him, so I assumed, this like grown gent now, right? is married. And I say, so you married? And he says, to scholarship. I'm married to scholarship. And so it seems quite fitting today that we're having this conversation at Harvard from the Center of African Studies. So I'm very excited because I think it's incredibly important work that you're thinking about that is worth having a conversation about, and it matters.
Thank you, Sihle, and thank you as well for the reminder, because I had actually forgotten about that ring and about that particular history, which I think is a history that began quite a while back.
Yes.
But I'm curious about two things, right, that I would like to start off the conversation with. The first is to say, for instance, how it is that we are both conceptualizing the Black Archive, right? So the work that I've been doing in this area of research has kind of touched on the poetry, the music, the art, the literature. And recently we had a conversation here at the Center for African Studies around food, food festival. And one of the colleagues, a chef Zoe, brings up the concept of decolonizing food. And I thought to myself, if one is thinking about Blackness, one cannot think about Blackness outside of that, right? So thinking about these aspects, I wonder if you would share with us your idea maybe around how you're conceptualizing the Black Archive and what it means to you.
I love the fact that you've brought food into the conversation because I think that the idea of a Black Archive really is about all of Black life. And I think something as like food, sometimes it can seem like mundane. Nobody thinks about like theorizing food. But I think when we begin to think about like how Black people have thought about food, where they get their food from the earth, right? Like that too is part of like a way of life, Ubuntu, a way of doing things. And I think that for me, I think of somebody like Toni Morrison who says, I wanted to capture Black people as they were, right? Like their joys, what they're like on a Sunday, having lunch. And I think for me, it's almost like thinking about us as like full human beings with our full ontology, nothing erased, nothing missing. And I think so often we have thought about Blackness in its duality, which is black versus white, and often Blackness is a shadow of everything that is white, right? Like, and in such ways that we almost like forget. I think there's this line that's been going around on social media lately around, it says, your ancestors gave you more than scars. And I think to me, the idea of then archiving who we are right now is our fullness of being, right? Like beyond trauma, beyond oppression, beyond the violence of our history, saying, who are these people that are existing at this time, in this life, in this way, and being able to tell a story that is reflective of our truth and our power and our fullness of being without the reductionism. And I think that's why it matters, so that in the future that we are not like a single view of a people, right? Like we were not only enslaved, right? Like, and people say slaves, but it's like, no, enslaved. But those were human beings with full rounded lives, with preferences, with ideas, with questions, with brilliance of thinking. And I think archiving that is being able to capture the entirety
of Black life.
Of Black life, right?
And I think part of it is you touch on something that in terms of the component of how Black folk on the continent relate to the concept of food. So the concept of the Black archive itself actually comes from a Zulu concept that I don't have a translative equivalence for in the English language, which is in Molobane, right? And the research project itself is in Molobane Yolwazi, right? Titled in Molobane Yolwazi. Now, because of Emily Apter's work, when she writes about untranslatables, I think about the fact that in trying to think about Molobane, which in isiZulu itself is denotative of a granary, right? Where we store the grains of the harvest for the next season, right? I think about processes of archiving, right? I think about processes of, and this of course also becomes the space, the storage space becomes the space where we're able to not only just store spaces, but modify seeds, right? In terms of producing, seeds that are able to survive certain seasons. So when I'm thinking about that, so and I'm thinking about in Molobane, I'm thinking about a space from which I can not only excavate but also sow, right? Sowing the fields for the life-giving properties and qualities that are to come, that will be that will give us sustenance, right? So when I'm thinking about the Black archive, I'm thinking about Molobane Yolwazi, right? I'm thinking about this repository of knowledge that is attendant to how we desire, how we love, that is attendant to how we hope, our fears, our dreams, our ambitions. And that comes up, of course, in the music. It comes up in, there's that song Kauleza by Miriam Makeba, and the beautiful preface that she does to the song, which is to say, Kauleza is a South African song. It comes from the reservations, locations, and townships near Johannesburg, right? It's a mechanism. She's theorizing in that moment how Blackness, how indigenous subjectivity was responding to a totalitarian and authoritarian government, where the kids would shout from the streets to say, Mama, please hide, do not let them catch you, because we know that if you get taken away, we don't know if you're coming back or not, right? So I'm thinking about all of that, and thinking about how that history, that knowledge can become what we call in isiZulu umandulo, owandulela umfumfu, right? So thinking about the preparatory seasons, the months of September, October, where we will begin to sow, right? I'm thinking about the Black archive as a space from which we sow. And this brings me to the next question, right? The next question being the question around who would you say, for instance, in your reading, are the individuals who are possibly or probably contributing to the Black archive, and what does that contribution look like? Because it's shifting, right? From the 19th century to the 20th century to the 21st century. There are shifts happening between those two spaces, or those temporal spaces in any case,
I love that reference to Kauleza, because I think what's been very interesting to me to think about is what Njabulelo talks about, right? Like the return of the ordinary, right? Like the rediscovery of the ordinary. And somebody who's been particularly important in my reading, I think for me, I'm thinking about more a lens of seeing the world, or being able to see what exists in the moment, to be able to develop a new understanding of our historical archive, which is where really I have been. And somebody like Barbara Boswell, with her book, And Wrote My Story Anyway. And in that book, what Barbara does is that she looks at South African women's literature. So she looks at Mamsindwe Magona, Gcina Mhlophe, Zuki Savannah, and a couple of others. And what she does there is to talk about this idea of like when we think about theory in South Africa or in Africa or in the world in general, we often want to think about very big ideas. And in the past, what's been said is that black women in South Africa weren't writing theory, right? They were writing stories. And those stories were stories about feeding the children or cleaning the house, like very domestic kind of ideas, right? And so this was not deemed as theory. And so she then insists and she says, no, this women's writing is theory, right? So that for me was so powerful in being able to like review what I think about as intellectual. And so I think that particular book has been really, really powerful. And it's led me, and I think I've just recently shared with you the documentary on my mother titled uNobuntu, and how my mom was writing poetry in 1983, that before that book, I wouldn't have thought about my mother as an intellectual, right? Like, and I think part of the rediscovery of the archive is being able to see what people amongst you have been creating and writing, what seems ordinary, and being able to intellectualize it and theorize it and be able to actually create from it. And so I think that's definitely where I am at the moment in being able to think about women's work in particular, which has been so outstanding. I think she's done incredible work. Somebody like Pumla Dineo wrote a book last year, Miriam Tladi. Loretta Ngobo, there's a book that came out this year. There's work that so many incredible writers are doing at the moment. Atambile Masoila, Panashe Chukumadzi, Buhlengab as well. They're all writing about Charlotte, right? Like, but there's so much rediscovery again, anew, of those works, and I think that that's particularly important, and that's really where I am at the moment in being able to think about those works. Yeah.
There's something that you did, which I'm very fascinated by. So your response focuses very deliberately on black women.
Yeah.
And I love that for a number of reasons, because I think that for a very long time we haven't allowed ourselves to see black womanhood as a site of theory, as a site of knowledge, right? We're thinking of theory in terms of stuff that comes from the global north, right? We're thinking of theory as something that is responsive vis-a-vis it being developed by white men, right? We think of the academy, we think of ideas of knowledge as in these hollowed halls of Harvard University, of Rhodes University, of your universities of Cape Town, right? We don't think of knowledge as a mundane, an ordinariness. And Zoe Wickham, in conversation to an extent, right, with Unjabulo Ndebele, are thinking precisely about this, to say, okay, what's going to happen? What's going to be the South African post-apartheid story? And this is why I like the focus on black womanhood as a subject of theorization, just because of what that does in terms of answering the question of who are the contributors to the black life.
I'm interested for you in what stirred both, not just your curiosity, because I don't think that's what it is, it's your investigation into the subject, because I think it's such a fundamental aspect of the work that you do. But what ignited the fire? Because I think there is like a
so simple. It's a really simple response. It's not that deep. In the sense that I grew up and my mother was reading uMqhayi to me and to my sister. She was reading AC Jordan. So uMqhayi Zityala Mawele, Jordan Zinqumbu Yeminyanya. Works that have been very, very instrumental in my theorization and even in my doctoral work, right? So I've really kind of focused in on some of these. And the real reason is because there was a safety that I felt. My mother's an English teacher, English and history. And there was something that was just so beautiful when she read me those stories, because it gave me the impression that our people are people with valid knowledge. Our people have an imagination. And there was a curiosity in the kinds of questions that I get from Umkai and Jordan, right, in terms of what is happening to blackness, right? And she's reading these texts, and we've got these texts all over the house because this is what she's read at school, as a teacher training. This is what she's reading. She's reading this material, right? And so both scholars are asking the question of what is modernity doing to us? What is modernity doing to the condition of Xhosa ontology, Xhosa metaphysics? And of course, I'm a Zulu boy, right? And so in school, I read isiZulu, coming from this childhood of engaging Xhosa literature.
Yes.
And reading isiZulu, studying, learning the stories that our people tell, I think to myself, but we are here, we have been present. We have always been present. You have stories like, for instance, Indandatho Yegolide, talking precisely to the mundaneness of our lives and the complexities of our lives and the nuances of our lives, to say it's not all oppression.
It isn't.
It's not all violence. It's love, it's desire, it's the aspiration for family. And so I think my mother becomes the focal point, the entry point for me, right? My mother becomes the person that I'm thinking with as I write. And the focus on music.
And yet then there's this need to suggest that if your mother is talking about those subjects,
she's not a site of knowledge,
and it's not theory that she's talking about, right?
And I think that's what I think for me was fascinating, because I was, and I continue to be intrigued by these incredible black women who are curious, who are creative, who are inventive,
who are defying,
and yet who at the very same time are, in their curiosity, circumstance relegates them to domesticity. Right? And so what they do is that they then say, okay, how do we pave the way forward for? And this brings me to something, right, in the sense of the film, the documentary that you've just recently screened in California at Silicon Valley at the Film Festival is a documentary about your mother's own writing, right?
It is.
And I'm thinking about that conversation, that intergenerational conversation in terms of our mother's writing and how we pick up, right, as this generation in terms of that and what that means for, again, a contribution to the Black Archive. And I think part of that will lead us to the next question, which is around the digital Black Archive, right? So we've covered the question of what is the Black Archive and how we're conceptualizing and theorizing maybe the Black Archive. To who are the contributors? As part of that contribution, how does that contribution relate to a more global audience in the form of film, in the form of digital media, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious if you would just like to talk to a bit about your mother's poetry, her own writing, and what's that meant for you.
Sure. So maybe let me just share a bit of like the genesis of that work. So I host the Ultimate Book Show, which is a TV show really about unearthing the stories behind the books, the scholarship, the visual arts of writers and creators across the world. And what I began to realize after having read Barbara Boswell's And Wrote My Story Anyway was that people like poets Pokazi Jonas or children's writer and artist Buhle Ngaba, or someone like Sindwe Magona as well, and Professor Zeksinda, we're all talking about the connectedness between their work and their mothers, and how their mothers are either like reviewing their books, right, or their grandmothers were the ones who would tell them to write a letter in this way. Actually, even though they were illiterate, they would say something like "Iti dear nombuiseko mntanam," right? Like, so they were giving instruction or almost like a frame on how to understand the world. And I think for me, that kind of connection, conversation made me realize, because part of how I ended up publishing my first book, Wanda, was that I was actually trying to help my mom publish. And it's funny because I don't think I ever necessarily took my mom seriously as a writer, because she's very like idealistic, very optimistic. It's like, hi guys, just put me in a room for 1 week, I'll bring the book out, you know, like, and I just thought, oh my God, my mom's like overly positivity in some ways almost makes her like underestimate the process, right? But I always thought about like people from outside as writers and creators. So I think of like Maya Angelou, Alice Walker, or right,
Toni Morrison.
Toni Morrison, and then you speak about those people in like very like extraordinary ways. And so during the pandemic, that's when I started like then taking this manuscript, right, and saying, let me actually like read through it. And I took it to a reviewer as well, and they were like, oh my goodness, right, like your mom's like a real writer. And I think it's then when where almost like you understood that you were trying to like almost like shape a dream for a parent, but like you don't even understand like the extent to which they have this kind of talent. And I think for me, what it opened me up to was to almost like what I began to discover there, which is something that I'm thinking about quite deeply there, is like who the person is. So the person who is writing and putting pen to paper, who they are, and the influences that have made them who they are. And I thought, because you've been role-playing them all your life, they were just your mother, there is so much knowledge that is missed. And I was thinking today, I'm like, if we deny the people that we come from their fullness, what is it that we are denying ourselves of too, right? Because then the assumption is that we're this like burst of new knowledge, like, wow, Siseko. And it's like, no, you know, like you're not an anomaly in this family. You're not like the outlier. You actually come from like a generation, a legacy, a lineage of thinkers. And so I think for me, that's kind of like been like such a big subject. And then I realized, I'm like, my grandmother writes, actually. My grandmother would tell stories, but I think they weren't archived in the way that books are. And I think Bibi Bakari Yusuf speaks about this, of like in the past, there weren't the knowledge infrastructures to be able to circulate this knowledge in ways that say that these are people who are smart. But I think, that kind of like, that was really important for me in terms of being able to like ground my own identity and my own thinking. And suddenly now I'm like, I do write poetry. Wait, I am a poet, right? Like, and I think there are things that I couldn't claim before because I was also denying the people that I come from who they fully are. And I think that really becomes the danger of not knowing enough about the knowledge systems of where we come from.
But I think it starts from a particular articulation of what and who a knower is, right?
Oh my God, so good.
So Europe gives us this concept of the cis heterosexual white man, right? So he comes from nowhere. He has no history. He has no past. He's your Levinas. He's your Heidegger. He's your Hegel. He's your Immanuel Kant. He's all of these characters who just. He's your Descartes, right? Who are this wealth of knowledge that comes from nowhere, right? And so, what we then do. But that was not our way of developing knowledge, right? Back in terms of, if you trace back the histories of knowledge development, that wasn't it, right? So what we then do is that we then kind of ascribe that to say, if I know my mother, the proximity delegitimates her. If I know my grandmother, the proximity, because the figure of the writer is the figure that I don't know. It is somebody who is, who in 50, in 100 years' time will be investigated by scholars doing their PhDs of, who was Heidegger in conversation with? Who was Hegel in conversation with? How did they come to make these particular claims? So that's how we think about the writer, the knower.
But
right?
my thing is, what does it do to you?
Of course, it devalues.
Right?
It devalues the capacity to learn. It devalues the capacity to learn because I'm always learning from something that is external, something that is extrinsic, right? Going back to some of the concepts that I discuss in my own scholarship, which is the notion of reclaiming the ontological legitimacy of blackness, right? Which is to say, we are worthy in and of ourselves as black folk, right? So, and we've got to take that seriously. And the question that I then pose is, what does the world look like when I contend with the fact that black people are knowers? When I contend with the fact that how we have kept our lives running is because there is a knowledge system that existed on the continent prior to the white man inventing Africa, as Mudimbe says, right? There was a lifetime of knowledge that runs through our veins, right? So, and this brings me back to the concept then of how do we, with the proximities that we have to knowledge workers that have not always been regarded as knowledge workers, what do we do with that process, with that knowledge? What do we do with that proximity, right? And for me, the translation becomes a translation of the digital archive, right? So the Black digital archive, where we are able to create resources and spaces where we can share the fact that no matter how quote-unquote provincialized these knowers are, they're still knowers, right? They're people who are producing work, who are thinking about their lives, because it is not to say that theory is something that is abstract, that comes from outside. It is about thinking about how do I theorize, for instance, the question of how do I make life move from day to day. That is a process of theorization. Language becomes a process through intellection of theorizing, right? And part of it is to go back to giving a certain sense of respect and deference to that knowledge. And here I wanna go to something that I think is quite interesting in terms of your mother's poetry is written in isiXhosa.
Yes, it is.
And I'm curious about that. I'm curious about
language,
what that means again for us, and that proximity to knowledge, which is to say, what does our knowledge do for us?
Yes, completely.
Right? What does our knowledge do for us, and how does that knowledge link up to our languages? So I wonder if you wanna say a bit about that particular movement between knowledge and language.
Yes, completely.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one is about, I think language is about being, right? It's about the soul of a person. And I think that when that is extracted, or when that is like shrinked, which commonly it is, right, in a very anglophonic kind of like way of communicating, that I think there's so much of ourselves that we can't even translate in terms of meaning, because the way in which we connect to the world is through a medium that isn't necessarily our home language, right? And so I think with my mom, it's being able to hear her story in her words, through her own soul. I think that really was like the power of it. But that question reminds me, earlier on this year, I interviewed Professor Sihle-Isipho, who is the writer of stories like Nyana Womtu, and he writes in isiXhosa. And I remember before the interview, because all his works actually are in isiXhosa, and I remember thinking, what am I going to do? Because we're preparing the work for television, right? Like I'm like, and I was quite doubtful. I'm like, I haven't studied isiXhosa as intensely since like high school, and almost like being nervous about how to like connect with him, and almost being nervous about even reading the work, and then delving into the stories and like being lost in that translated world, like into that world completely, into the stories. My mom was like half reading with me, and she'd come and be like, oh yes, and like, and the stories would climax in such like intensive ways that you can imagine visually the places where these stories are taking place. But I sat with Professor Sihle-Isipho and we had the full conversation in isiXhosa. And the thing about it for me was that even for myself, because I've almost come to like to read myself through this like English lens that I'm used, I think, and maybe like unconsciously, right? Like you almost like deem your intelligence in this particular language. That when I was done, I was like, that was such a fulfilling and complete conversation. And the thing that he was saying in it, he was saying that he thinks that the loss of identity is because of the loss of language. And he says, Abandwana, I watch them, and I watch them like just sitting, and he's like, and he's like, and he's like, because akakwazi uthetha ilwimi lakhe, right? Like, and I think it's like there's something that I think it's almost like a reclamation of the self. Language is about the reclamation of your own being. And I don't think you realize how powerful and important it is until you almost experience it, right? Like until you are captivated by your own words from your own people in a way, right? Like,
And this brings me to something, going back to the definition of the Black Archive, or being constitutive of literature and poetry. So there's a book back at home that I'm certain you know very well, Alan Payton's Cry the Beloved Country, a book that is still prescribed in high school today for young black children to read. And it was never a set work when I was at school, but I remember the girls at Pietermaritzburg Girls High were reading that book. And so, being the curious person that I am, I decided I'm going to read the book myself. And I found it incredibly uncomfortable reading that book, and I didn't know why. And then Busiso Nyembezi, because that book came out in 1948. In 1957, 9 years later, he translates the book into Lafe Lihle Kakhulu. I still have the copy, and it's damaged. And it's damaged because as I was reading it in isiZulu, I flung it across the room. I did, because I was repulsed by the image that Alan Payton creates of the black boy. Now, to talk about the vividness of being able to see a story when it is written in mother tongue and when you receive it in your mother tongue, I threw the book across the room, and I understood in that moment why I had hated Johannesburg so much as a kid, and the fears around Johannesburg, because the image that I have of Johannesburg is Unyana Kakumalo, who was this vagrant, vagabond kind of thing, right? Impregnates a woman, fails to take responsibility, stirs up trouble, and Igoli being the space where it takes away from a certain moral fiber. Even if you think about Ukhumalo as he arrives in Johannesburg, looking for Usiswake, that whole entire conversation, the destitution of blackness that Alan Payton portrays, which you don't necessarily get when you're reading it in English. When I read it in isiZulu, I see something completely different. I see a world of lack. And you see the train moving from Ilobo, going up to Leli Goli that is famed, right? And you see, and again, I grew up in Mzimkhulu. I was born in Mzimkhulu, and I see this kind of trek, right? Moving through Itlopo, these flowing green, luscious mountains coming into this concrete, lifeless, deadened place in isiZulu. When I'm reading it in isiZulu, I see that. And that goes to show, for me, in any case, brings me to the biggest objection, right? So white liberals back at home will say, but Alan Payton is one of the best individuals to have written Cry the Beloved Country. Best for who? Jan. What is he doing to the young black child who then aspires, when they're reading Alan Payton, to become white, because the image of blackness that they're encountering as amoral is...
And the thing that you're saying there is that sometimes, almost because it's not in your own language, you're deadened to understanding, right, the seed it's actually sowing into your being about how you see yourself, right? Like, I was reading the other day, there's a from The Education of a British Protected Child by Chinua Achebe, and he writes there that his daughter was 4 years old, right? Chinelo comes back home and says to the dad, please don't call me black anymore, call me brown. I mean Chinua Achebe has like been thinking about these subjects. He's like, what? This child who I'm like, you are beautiful, you are black, you are proud. And then he says, I then find the children's book that this child is reading, and it describes this white boy who runs on a kite, and it like flows over mountains and waters and seas, and then this flight, like kind of like this white boy loses the kite, and then a black boy standing on a tree like is basically wrapped in this kite. It falls on him, and then the imagery becomes completely defunct, right? Like, But you can imagine if you're reading it in English, it's just like this kai da da da. But if you were to read that in your language, actually,
Yes.
it's not only visually destructive, but you actually understand that this is like chemically, like I think it actually just changes your very like neural pathways and your nervous system and who you are.
And you're repulsed by an image of yourself.
In your own language. And I think part of it is that there is no way anybody can insult you in that. There's words you don't say in your own language that are sayable in English, right? Like,
exactly. And so I think part of it, right, is the function of language, right? So how does, because I begin to see Alan Payton for Alan Payton, mangabe ngimfunda ngesizulu. And I think about some of the short stories, which is one of the short stories that we did, where he's writing about this, you know, black father who's coming home. It's a Friday, payday. He's got his wages, and then these black boys rob him. And one of the people, or one of the boys who rob him, is one of his own sons, one of his own children, right? And when I read that, I remember I was in Standard 10, grade 12. I was in Mrs. Orchard's class, and I remember thinking, and I hated it because I thought about the fact that I would never do that to him. I would never. What Payton writes in that short story, he develops black characters that are lacking Ubuntu.
Deficit. That
are lacking a sense of humanity. To think about kids who would run a black man into an abandoned car lot with used cars, beat him up, take his money, and one of those kids is his very own son. Then you ask yourself, why do we have the kind of violence that we have in our society? Because our kids are reading this stuff in school. Why do we have the kind of amorality that we have? Which is why, for instance, you know, there's a connection in the scholarship that I make between the concept of language and remembering, right? Language and a process of reconstitution, a process of memory, right? Because it's exactly what you say, in the sense that if you do not know the language, how can you facilitate a process of becoming? Whether you're becoming human, whether you're becoming a citizen, whatever process of becoming, what do you become? You become an image either that has been created of you, or you want to become anything but that image that has been created of you.
So good.
Right? So then you have this aspiration among a lot of black folk, young black folk, of wanting to become an embodiment of whiteness. Because everything that they see that is good in the literature, everything that they see, which is one of the reasons why it is so beautiful to look at the music, right? And I'll say this as a last thought, is, you know, just to give an example of some of the work that we've been doing. At the University of Fort Hare, during the first semester this year, I taught a class on the introduction to philosophy. And I used the work of Obrigwana, music.
Yes.
I took that into class, I invited it into class, and I invited him, the musician, into my class as well. And I said to my students, listen to this piece of music, read it against Chinua Achebe's critique of Joseph Conrad, read it against Lewis Gordon's work, read it against everything that we've done, the intellectual stuff, and tell me if Obrigwana is philosophizing in his music. The first response that I get from my students is, hell no, he isn't. Right? Because again, how do we understand philosophy? Heidegger, Kierkegaard, Sartre, these are the philosophers we know. Then of course there's the conception of, there's a particular methodology of philosophy, right? And these are my first years. So these are students fresh out of high school, fresh into university, and they're saying to me, Obrigwana is not a philosopher. And part of it is that process of saying, how have we externalized? So the familiar will never be philosophy. How can the familiar be philosophy? Because I can hear Obrigwana as he's singing. He's singing Eyedwa, he's performing a socio-political critique. He's surfacing and highlighting the problem of femicide in South Africa, which gives us an ethical analysis. He's doing so much, but how is that philosophy? Because he's saying eyedwa, and that's something that I know.
That's something I know.
I can relate to that. So it can never be philosophy because I can relate to it. Philosophy is this thing that's.
I mean, I'm thinking about in this paper, right, Kauleza, right, where you speak about the South African higher education system. No, actually, I think it's this one, revealing power of language and developing theory from historical artifacts, right, of when a student enters into a higher education institution in South Africa, what it is that they have to leave behind to understand themselves as thinking beings.
Yes.
And ideally, there's nothing relevant in terms of like the examples that are in your class, right? About like, there's nothing about being rural, right? Like there's nothing about the context in which you come from. And there's such a need to almost like literally drip yourself dry of your being so that you can enter into that space, and everything that you have suddenly becomes meaningless. You are baseless, you are just dark and grave, and you need to be almost like poured into entirely by whiteness. And something that just even beyond language, the extent to which I think that our history and the evilness, actually, it's very cruel, has been that you must be as far away as possible from what you are. And something that I, just with my students during the pandemic, I had one student saying to me, with online learning, the digital space, what they struggle with the most is asking questions at the end of the class. Because in class, they would walk down to their lecturer and go and speak to them. But now in the open class where everybody's online, they'll hear their accent. And their accent will tell where they come from. It will be a signal that they aren't as competent, they're not as intelligent, right? Like, and so you think about just that simple thing. And I mean, something like, I have one of my very close friends. They didn't go to a Model C school, but they have such incredible ability to communicate, but they don't use it. And the sense of, because I don't sound
a particular kind of way,
it suggests that I'm not intelligent. And so even just like that identity intersects into the digital medium in terms of who is actually pouring that data that we so desperately need to be able to archive who we are, because only a select group, it's almost like becomes like an exclusive space as well for people to be able to record their stories.
Yes.
And I think what we've said is that if you're not as close in terms of approximation as possible to whiteness, then what you have to say
is invalid.
And I think that level of invalidation of your actual being and identity means that the way in which you live your life, right? Like, it has to be from that very low, emptyless space. And I think what then people are able to access and have and enjoy, and the kind of peace that you can actually accord to yourself as being deserving of it, is so limited.
For sure. And what it breeds, again, is, and I often say this in the work, right, in my scholarship, as I'm investigating the question of the Black Archive, is that the process of developing knowledge is intimately tied to the life possibilities that I'm willing into existence through the process of writing. So what I am writing, what I am philosophizing, if I am constantly philosophizing Hegel on the southernmost tip of the African continent, I am forgetting about legitimating what it means to be on the southernmost tip of the African continent, of thinking through what it means to be black, to be in Africa, to be, and so that's what happens.
And how will you find solutions for your people? Like, you know what I mean? Like where will they come from?
if I'm always in conversation with Hegel, if I'm always in conversation with Heidegger, it means that I'm not giving enough weight to the ontological legitimacy of the political project of home.
But it actually tells you how preposterous, like the hegemony of whiteness is. Because how will Hegel know more about
my people,
your
my
people,
context, my
your
experience
than you? And you also almost have to like give up your power. Like you understand that that's what you have to do
in order to access a particular world. And so as we wrap up, I want to ask you, Sihle.
No, man, it's a mess. It's actually,
of course it is. But I guess what I want to ask from you as a fellow Black archivist, as a storyteller, as an intellectual, and I think, the work that you do is so far more important in the sense of it's telling our stories, not being bound up into these incredible, voluminous books that sit in libraries and gather dust. The stories you tell are actually interfacing with our people. What is the hope that you have as we begin this series of conversations with other scholars and experts on the Black Archive? What is the hope that you have in terms of this resource that we're trying to develop? What is the hope that you have for the Black Archive and the Black Digital Archive?
I want to make a quick example. Do you know Sindwe Magona, when she says when she wrote To My Children's Children, she says that because she knew that nobody cared about an ordinary black woman, she said, I thought 2,000 years from now, for posterity, they're going to ask, how did the people live like outside of all like the big men who went to exile, right? Like, and she says, I thought they will find this manuscript, right? Like 2,000 years from now. So she's like, people keep saying, you are so honest in your book. She's like, because I thought I'm writing for 2,000 years from now. Let me write everything about who I am and what I am, right? Like, and I think what you have in that story is somebody who had self-regard, right? Like the art of self-regard, the sense of worth, the right of being, and
the capacity to dare to see yourself.
To dare to see yourself. Ooh, I love that. To dare to see yourself. And I think for too long, to be black in the world has been an insistence through the white lens for invisibility. And for me, I think that my work, starting with the children's work that I do, the work of redemption. I almost always think of who's this lady, Truman, who rescued the slaves. Who is this woman?
Sojourner Truth.
Yes, right. I know. I almost imagine like there's a line by Lewis Clark that says there are places like this everywhere, places that we enter as young boys and girls that we never return. And I almost like imagine like this journey where you almost like walking and there's people like in the crevices. You're like, come on out of there, right? Like, come on out of there. Let's go. Let's get out. Let's go. And I think the idea to me of the work that we're creating is about that. It's like the places that we had entered, the non-redemptive grave-like places in our souls. It's like, come out, right? This is who you are, right? Like, there's a line Nomampila says that I think is so beautiful, where she talks about Ubuntu. She says, Ubuntu, wenza nje. And I think it's that. It's like the new visual image of our being and our identity, redeeming us, right? And I think that's what I want to do. I hope that this work is going to tell a more beautiful story, a more joyful story, a more capable story, and that we will live out of the fullness of who we are. I love that.
Wenjenje.
Oh dear, and that's what my grandmother would say to us. Yes. We're not trying to be more human. We already are.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And I think part of that talks to, in certain ways, challenging the quote-unquote post-humanist discourse that has now, captured the Western academic world, because we were always post-human. It wasn't an anthropocentric. It wasn't an anthropocentric worldview. It was a worldview that understood indobana wenjenje. Exactly.
Wenjenje.
Thank you so much, Sihle, for taking the time to join us. I know that while you were here in the United States, there's so much work that you did, which was incredibly brilliant. And I hope and I look forward to seeing how the process of reimagining the future will look like, not only for Blackness, but also for humanity as a whole.
I want to say thank you to you for being the kind of bold, brave, crazy human being that you are, because what you do, which is so important, is that you give us a visual representation of what that ontological fullness can look and feel like. You demand your space in the world, right? And not only do you demand it, you claim it and you just live it out. There's no fuss, there's no air about it. It's rightfully yours. And I think you become the glowing light to us of what we can be when we are better. So I only want you to continue insisting on that, because it is our freedom.
Thank you.
It's light and freedom to us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.